Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope everybody's doing well today. It's Friday, July 17th. I usually don't go live on Fridays, but here we are. It's Friday, and I'm going live. It's got a little free time, and I don't know if you can hear it or not, but apparently somebody outside my office thinks this is a speedway, and he has whatever vehicle he has started and finds it necessary to rev it up at a high number of RPMs. So, not sure what's going on with that, but if you hear anything weird and rumbling in the background, that's all it is. All right, so we're studying through a series of claims by the American Atheist Association that the Bible is full of contradictions, and today we're going to cover one. We're going to look at one that's found supposedly, allegedly, that's the term we're using, between Judges chapter 1 and verse 19 and Matthew chapter 19 and verse 26. So again, looking at these terms here, by way of definition, when we're talking about alleged, what are we talking about? Well, I can see that something's not looking right on my screen here, so let me try to adjust that real quick. But alleged, by definition, is accused but not proven. There we go. Accused but not proven or convicted. The Bible is a collection of 66 ancient religious documents that claim to be inspired by God, and a contradiction is a combination of statements that are opposed to one another. So, again, is Judges 1:19 in contradiction with Matthew chapter 19, verse 26. So here's what we're looking at in those two passages. Matthew 19:26 tells us, and with God all things are possible. And in Judges chapter 1 and verse 19, we find, I'm still having a little trouble here, we find that the Lord was with Judah, and he drove out all the inhabitants of the mountain, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron. So again, are we really dealing with a Bible contradiction here? And since my PowerPoint, I don't know what's going on with that. I don't know why it's wanting to do that, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn that off. It's bothering me. So here's where I want to start. I want to start looking at Judges chapter 1 and verse 19. Of course, we've looked at Judges in the past and dealing with what's the guy's Jephthah. Jephthah's vow yesterday. Couldn't think of his name. Judges chapter 11. So this is another one that the American atheists present as a contradiction. What we have going on here in the early chapters of Judges is the aftermath of Joshua's leadership. Joshua's died. All the elders that have served during his lifetime, they're dying, and a new generation has come forth that is not doing what God would have them to do. So we need to understand that historical context as well. And like I said yesterday in talking about Jephthah, this period of Israelite history recorded in the book of Judges is really the dark ages of Israel. And when I mean the dark ages, I mean spiritually. Just some terrible events, some very bad people. There's always been terrible events and very bad people, but it just seems like this period in Israel's history is especially dark. This about 400 years of history. So the early chapters of Judges, the early chapters of that book, discuss or explain the process of Israel taking over the promised land. So the book of Joshua is called the book of conquest. Of course, the first mission that Joshua takes on as leader is the destruction of Jericho. Joshua chapters 5 and 6. And the rest of that book covers not only the process of conquering the land from the Canaanite enemies of Israel, but also the division of the land, being divided up among the tribes of Israel. So when we then turn to the pages of the book of Judges, we're still in the first few chapters dealing with that process, particularly driving out the inhabitants of Canaan and the allotment of the land. And I guess really this discussion of the fact that certain inhabitants were not being driven out It really does start in the days of Joshua. Now again, Joshua served as Moses' minister for 40 years throughout the wilderness. The Bible tells us that. And he was if we want to use this terminology, he was the next in line to take the leadership. But even throughout the book of Joshua, okay, let me look here. Beginning really in Joshua chapter 13. So I marked it this way in the margin of my Bible here throughout the book of Joshua. Beginning in chapter 13, we see this happening where Israel is not doing what God says. So just for instance, Joshua 13, verse 13. Nevertheless, the children of Israel did not drive out the Geshurites or the Maacathites, or the Geshurites and the Maacathites dwell among the Israelites until this day. See, one of the things that God had told them particularly throughout the time of the wilderness wandering, listen, when you get to this land, there are going to be enemies there, there are going to be pagans there, you need to drive them out. And if you don't drive them out, it's going to be a problem for you. So Joshua chapter 13, verse 13 starts recording the fact that Israel didn't do what God said. And another thing that God had told them, listen, if you keep every word of this law, just for instance, read Joshua chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. If you keep every word of this law, if you do what I tell you to do, I'll be with you, I'll fight for you, I'll drive out the inhabitants. The thing is, Israel had to do her part. She had to keep up her end of the bargain, you might say. So the second time that's recorded is Joshua chapter 15 and verse 63. It says, as for the Jebusites, so the Jebusites, that's the Jebus, Jebus, that's another name for Jerusalem. So as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwell among the children of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. Again, and then chapter 16 and verse 10, and they did not drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwelt among the Ephraimites to this day, and have become forced laborers. You go to Judges chapter 17 and what verse is that? Verses 12 and 13. And it just goes on. Israel was not doing what God told them to do. They were not driving out the inhabitants of the land. So when we then open to the book of Judges, that's where we are historically. Israel is once again forsaking God. And when you think about it, when Israel was delivered from Egypt, it started within 2 months. Within 2 months of them having been delivered from generations of slavery, they start complaining and they start disobeying. That's why, just for instance, when you open your New Testament and you look at like Acts chapter 7, when Stephen's preaching to the Jews in Jerusalem, he said, listen, you are stiff-necked and hard-hearted people, just like your ancestors were. This is a generational problem that we see with the Israelites, that they're not going to do what God says. There would always be a faithful remnant. There would be some who were faithful and dedicated to God, but by and large, the nation of Israel was very rebellious against God. So when we open to Judges chapter 1, that's where we are in history. Again, Joshua and the people that served with him are dead, and they're still, even during the days of Joshua, Israel was still not doing what they were supposed to do. So let's consider a couple things here. So again, Judges chapter 1, verse 19, it says, so the Lord was with Judah. Now this is interesting because, again, the American Atheist website says that God couldn't drive out the inhabitants. And if you're looking at a King James version, for those who are following along, when you look at Judges 1:19, it reads like this. So the Lord was with Judah, and he drove out the mountaineers, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland, because they had chariots of iron. And so the impression that you get is the he is God. I'm reading from the New King James. Listen to this. It sounds a little differently. And I consulted some other versions that I have, and they read this same way. So verse 19 says, so the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland. It's not saying that God couldn't do it. God had already, and again, we read this throughout the law of Moses, while they're wandering through the wilderness, I have given you the land, go in and possess it. I'll be with you, I'll fight for you, if you are faithful. So if it reads, they drove out, but they could not drive out, instead of he, that's quite interesting. That's quite an interesting difference. And I actually have a 3-volume set in my library. It's actually here behind me by a Hebrew scholar named J. Green. It's a 3-volume set of the Hebrew and English interlinear Old Testament. And it reads the same way that the New King James does. It says, I had it down looking at it earlier, so the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not. It doesn't say he could not. So Mark says, so you're saying everything is possible with God, but is conditional? We're going to get there, but I think that certainly plays into it. Debbie, God continued to give the Israelites chances over and over. Oh man, yeah, absolutely. Read Nehemiah chapter 9 sometime, and the prayer that the Levites, the national prayer of confession that the Levites give. And it tells you exactly what you're saying there, Debbie. So let's look at a few verses apart from Judges chapter 1 and verse 19. I think there's textual credibility to say, instead of he couldn't drive out these people, they couldn't drive out these people. Again, multiple English versions read that way, but even the Hebrew English interlinear Bible reads that way. I'm going to go to Exodus chapter 34 and look at something here. Exodus 34, beginning in verse 11. Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I am driving. So this is God speaking to Israel. Behold, I am driving out before you the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst. But if you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images, for you shall worship no other God, for the Lord your God is a jealous God. So, again, he says, I am driving them out. He was doing this, but the thing is, Israel had to do her part. They had to go in battle. They had to put their faith in God that he would drive them out, but they had to go fight the battle. They're not doing that. Again, start reading in Joshua chapter 13 and notice how many times it's mentioned they would drive out these inhabitants, but they wouldn't drive out these inhabitants. That's a big deal there. And then I'm going to go to Numbers 33. And let's see, Numbers chapter 33, beginning in verse 50. It says, Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, When you have crossed the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants. So think about that just a minute. What we just read in Exodus 34 said, I am driving out the inhabitants. Now we're here in Numbers chapter 33. When you get to the land, you shall drive out all the inhabitants. Again, Numbers 33:52. That's not a contradiction. God was working with and for Israel, but Israel had to do her part. Destroy all their engraved stones, destroy all their molded images, and demolish all their high places. You shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell in it, for I have given you the land to possess it. But again, they had to do what God required of them. This is conditional, as Mark said earlier in the comments here. And you shall divide the land by lot as an inheritance among your families. To the larger you shall give a larger inheritance. To the smaller you shall give a smaller inheritance. There everyone's inheritance shall be, whatever falls to him by lot. You shall inherit according to the tribe of your fathers. But now listen, so this is a key right here. Numbers 33 verse 55. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. Moreover, it shall be that I will do to you as I thought to do to them. So, I mean, it's obvious. There is no contradiction between, and we haven't even got to Matthew 19 yet, but there's no contradiction in what is said in Judges 1:19. First of all, it's not that God couldn't drive them out. And so I prefer the New King James reading here over the King James in Judges chapter 1 and verse 19. So Mark says in the comments, the word if is important to recognize in these verses. Absolutely. God's promises are conditional. You know, and incidentally, the same thing's true today. So I tell you, let's look at one more before we go to Matthew 19. Joshua 23, beginning in verse 11. Now this is Joshua's farewell speech to Israel. Listen to what he says. Joshua 23:11. Therefore take careful heed to yourselves that you love the Lord your God, or else if indeed you go back and cling to the remnant of these nations, okay, the people that they were supposed to be driving out from Canaan. If you go back and cling to them, these that remain among you, and make marriages with them, and go into them and they to you. So that's forbidden. Read Deuteronomy chapter 7. Know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps to you, and scourges on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from the good land which the Lord your God has given you. So repeatedly we're told, here's what it'll be if you do what I say, or what God says. Here's what it'll be if you don't do what God says. Again, it's not that God could not drive out the inhabitants of the land. It's that if Israel didn't obey his covenant, he would not. And there's a difference between couldn't and wouldn't. God wouldn't if they refused to obey. All right, so let's go then to Matthew chapter 19, verse 26. So what do we have over here? This is the discussion between Jesus and the rich young ruler. And Matthew 19:26 says, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. And of course, I mean, you know just as well as I do, the American Atheist website is not concerned with biblical exegesis. They're not concerned with being accurate with the biblical text. Their goal is to search the Bible in an effort to find alleged contradictions. That's what they're trying to do. So they're not going to take time to read the surrounding verses, to read other accounts. Just for instance, the rich young ruler, that account's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And when you look at all three passages, you see that there are elements in each that give you the meaning of the whole. So, again, Matthew 19:26, with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. He had just had this conversation with this wealthy young ruler, a good person who had kept the commandments from his youth, Matthew 19, verse 20, but there was one thing that he lacked, and that was his love of his money. You know, you can be a good person in the sense of keeping the commandments, but you can be covetous, and covetousness is idolatry, according to Colossians chapter 3. So I think a key to understanding the rich young ruler in its totality is the way Mark records it. So I'm going to turn over to Mark chapter 10. And again, the same discussion, so we're not going to go back over it all. Mark 10:23, how hard it is for those who have riches to enter the kingdom of God. And the disciples were astonished at his words, but Jesus answered again and said to them, children, how hard it is for those who trust in riches to enter the kingdom of God. And there's your key. So like I said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke record this event, but Mark records this one thing that Matthew and Luke don't. It's a clarification how hard it is for those who trust in their riches to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So what does it mean then, with God all things are possible? If your faith is in God instead of your wealth, anybody can be saved, even the richest of men. And you know, Paul talks about that over in 1 Timothy chapter 6. He told Timothy to teach those who are rich in this world not to trust in uncertain riches, but in God. So it's not impossible to be saved if your faith is in God. That's what we're talking about in, again, Matthew 19, Mark chapter 10, and Luke records it in his account in Luke chapter 18. I mean, to me, that's really all I've got to say in the textual sense here. There's no contradiction between Matthew 19:26 and Judges 1:19. It's so simple to sit down and just take a reading of the biblical text, not just one verse here in the Old Testament that has a different historical setting, obviously different characters, different events, and then to jump to the pages of the New Testament during the life of Christ and take one verse out of a teaching that's recorded in 3 different gospel accounts and twist it to make it say something that Judges 1:19 was not. And really, when you think about it, they're saying the exact same thing. I mean, to me, that's the irony here between this alleged contradiction presented by the atheist. Judges 1:19 and Matthew 19:26 are saying the same thing. Israel could be saved from their enemies if they trusted in God. It's not impossible. It's not that God couldn't drive out the opponents, it's that he wouldn't drive them out because Israel was unfaithful. That's exactly what Matthew 19:26 is saying. You can be saved if your faith is in God. If you keep the commandments, as is recorded there, but also if your trust is in the right place. Your trust is not in yourself. Your trust, your faith, your dependence is upon God, not yourself. I just think it's kind of ironic the way I look at those two verses. They're saying the exact same thing. Okay, well, this one's going to be a little bit shorter today. I mean, that's just too easy to understand when you consider a lot of other passages like we did. Numbers 33, Joshua 23, Exodus chapter 34. It's not. Here's the thing, and this is with any Bible topic. The Bible is not difficult to understand. Some things, as Peter said in 2 Peter 3:16, are hard to be understood more so than others. But that's where study comes in. That's where effort comes in. You know, if you're just picking a verse here and there, you're not going to have any clue what the Bible said. It's pretty simple. So a couple more comments and then we'll wrap it up. Too bad they don't put as much effort into understanding Scripture instead of trying to discredit it. Absolutely. Truth is not difficult to come to if you're honest, and that's the thing. You got to be honest with it. And then another comment. Atheism is funny. They fight against something they say doesn't exist. And here's the thing, and this is a fact. Atheism, and I've talked to many of them face to face, and through social media. They will claim all day long that atheism is not a belief system. It's not a religion. It is absolutely a religion. It is a system of beliefs. And they do advocate, you know, if there is no God, or if there is a God, this wouldn't happen, this wouldn't happen, this wouldn't happen. They spend a lot of energy and a lot of money, by the way, too, fighting against something they say does not exist. Yeah. That's it. That's all I've got today. A little bit shorter on Friday. I'm going to go home and eat some lunch. Hope you guys have a good rest of the day. As always, if you have any further questions or comments after the stream's over, you can still add it in the comment section here. The video is always available on our Facebook page, and it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Appreciate y'all being on here today. I appreciate the comments, and hope you have a good weekend, and we'll be live again congregationally Sunday at 10:45 on our public Facebook page here. So thanks for being here today, and have a good weekend.